Ladies and gentlemen, people of all gender expressions, thank you for checking out the North Bank Media Podcast. I am your host, Patrick Strevens. Joining me on the show this afternoon, all the way from Tennessee, was musician Mike Younger. Now, Mike was actually born in Canada, but for many decades, or a few decades at least, has pursued his career and his life stateside. Mike's latest album, Burnin' the Bigtop Down, was released in August of this year. Really, it's just a tremendous album. It's one of my favorites. It's, if you love blues rock, blues, even country and western, just rock and roll, R&B, there's a taste of all those great American genres on this album, and there's really, I think, something for everyone. Really check it out. That's Burnin' the Bigtop Down. The song you're hearing right now is called Soul Searchin', one of my favorites off the album. It's also an incredible story behind this album. The original sessions for this album took place over 20 years ago and featured some real heavy hitters of rock music. Jim Dickinson producing, his son Luther Dickinson on guitar, Levon Helm, the late great Levon Helm on drums, David Hood on bass, who's played with everyone from Aretha Franklin to Bob Seger, and just a handful of just professionals, and it shows. But beyond that, the story about why this album was recorded and then shelved and then released finally this year, you really have to hear it from Mike, and you really have to feel the emotion and the passion and get a sense of the scope of the journey that he went on to get this album made. So we did talk about that in detail. Also, Mike is quite an activist. I didn't know this really, but he had a lot to say about environmental activism and social activism, so I was more than happy to go there with him. A little bit of politics too, but back to the music ultimately in the end. This is a high watermark for this podcast, a thrill for me, one of my favorites that I've really couldn't be more proud to share this a little bit more broadly with some other communities. Please, really, I enjoy the hell out of this. I hope you will too. He's an excellent musician and a hell of a guy. Enjoyed spending almost 2 hours with him. This is my conversation with Mike Younger. Come along with me. Mike Younger, pleasure to have you on the North Bank Media Podcast, and it's really a thrill for me. So this means a lot, and I hope we can really dig into your latest album and some other things too.
Thanks, Patrick. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
So, I told myself don't gush, but like Burnin' the Bigtop Down, man, I love that album, start to finish, front to back. I could listen to that all day long. So thank you for doing that, putting that out there for people.
Well, thank you very much for the kind words.
It's a hell of a story, but I'm curious about it in the present. You just kind of got off the road. You were touring. Is that correct?
Yeah, we just did a 3-day run up through Kentucky and Missouri and came back through Memphis.
Wow.
Murray, Kentucky, St. Louis, Missouri, and Memphis on the way home. And we capped it off with a visit with we did a radio show podcast. Well, no, it's an internet radio show on Radio Memphis. The show's called Booze and Blues, and nice. My friends from the Memphis Blues Society hosted me up there for I brought the trio along. We played a place in Memphis called Hernando's Hideaway, and went over to the station and did a whole nother set for them live on the air. So
awesome. And
nice run.
No doubt. What's kind of been the reception to, did you play a lot of the songs off Big Top, or were you playing kind of a selection from your career? What's kind of been the mode lately?
Well, the focus is on the tunes that are on Burnin' the Bigtop Down, but we've had to do a bunch of 3-hour shows where we're playing 3:45s or 2 hour and hour and a quarter sets or something like that, and we've been dipping into some classic blues stuff. Nice. And when we went up the East Coast, we were playing some classic country as well, and pulling from a lot of my older records as well.
Right on. And when you're up there, are you primarily playing rhythm, or do you play a lot of the lead guitar stuff?
Well, it depends on who's in the crew.
Sure.
If it's just me and a bass player and a drummer, then I'm doing all the guitar work. So, but if there's a second guitar player, there's an opportunity throw it back and forth a little bit, and alternate between playing rhythm and leads.
Oh, cool. Because there's some really nice guitar stuff on Burning the Bigtop Down. Is some of that stuff you and then someone else that was in the studio?
I play a lot of the rhythm tracks and
Okay.
a couple of the secondary guitar tracks. I'm not between Bob Britt and Luther Dickinson, who played the bulk of the lead guitar work. There wasn't a lot of need for me to have my clumsy stumbling, lead guitar playing over top anything that they were doing. But I'm playing some rhythm parts and some arpeggios and those kind of things. And I think that there's a couple of them that I actually, I'd have to look at the record and pull it up. I'm not certain that there's any that I stepped out as the lead guitar player on this one, but maybe I haven't really looked at it from that point of view.
No, fair enough. It really struck me that, I don't know, a lot of the music I listen to is from the older era where that the guitar playing is kind of front and center. So it's refreshing to hear that in the modern day.
Yeah, I was very blessed to have Luther and Bob Britt, Luther Dickinson and Bob Britt bring their guitar playing to the table on this. It took on an altitude that they took it to a higher plane for sure.
Right on. What's kind of been the reception, from the critics or, your circle and other musicians in the scene about this album?
From the musicians that I run into, there's a lot of people vicariously feel the sense of share in my sense of triumph and overcoming, a seemingly insurmountable obstacle in my path.
Yeah,
I think a lot of my musician friends empathize with that and can relate to that. And vicariously get a bit of that from my experience. From the media and the critic world, I've been having a very, very positive response from the people who have covered it. From the people who have covered.
Well, that's good to hear. That's what it deserves, I would say.
Thank you. It's been really wonderful to forge new ties in Canada. I was born in Canada in Nova Scotia and left there when I was really young to pursue my career here in the US. And it's been wonderful that this album has put me in a position to reconnect with some of the communities in Canada that I would like to be visiting and performing in.
Oh, interesting. How has it allowed that? Just through people you've met, you're kind of reconnecting to the Canadian roots?
Yeah, people have been hearing about my record and I've done podcasts with other people from out in Alberta, and
nice.
There's, some attention, some press coverage out in Nova Scotia as well, because that's where I'm from.
Right.
And, I'm hoping to get back up there and be working in Canada a couple times a year, eventually in the future, as I can pull my business life together,
Right on. Well, I would love to. I hope to see you up here. Hope to catch a show someday if you ever do make it up this far north.
Well, I would love to be there. So, I look forward to crossing paths with you at some point.
Oh, wow, that'd be great. That'd be great. Like I said, I was blown away just by like you say, it's a triumphant story, this album, right? Can you, just for the listeners, can you kind of explain, we can get into the sessions, but what happened after you kind of went through these initial recording sessions? And this is 20 years ago, and this album was literally delayed 20 years. I'm just curious about why that happened.
Well, I don't know how much your listeners know about me, but I really the true scope of the story is starts at the beginning for me, which is, I when all my friends were going off to college and stuff, and I didn't know what to do with myself, and I had fallen in love with music, and I took my guitar and hit the road and played on street corners and city parks and subway platforms and business doorways and things like this, well into my 20s, and traveled Vancouver, Toronto, New York, New Orleans, and eventually got to play on a radio show in New Orleans that was heard by a Nashville publisher who signed me up to a publishing agreement. And I started traveling to Nashville to cut demos. And one of my demos reached Rodney Crowell.
Oh, yeah.
Who's a great and legendary country music performer here and producer. And he put out my first record. And that record was sort of my transition from being a street performer to a recording artist. And when I got around to making my second record on the heels of that one, which had gotten quite a bit of traction here in the US on AAA radio, and I, kind of on my way. I had some building to do, but it was moving forward, etc. And I went to make my second record, and Jim Dickinson, a Memphis legendary Memphis producer who's played keys on Rolling Stones, Arlo Guthrie. He's produced Toots and the Maytals, and just a ton of amazing music. The Replacements, stuff that I had listened to since I was very young. Jim Dickinson was brought into the picture by my label as a potential producer, and when I met with him and we discussed what his plan, how I played a bunch of songs for him, and we discussed what his production vision was, and came to terms about moving forward and working together. We got some dates on the calendar, and he brought up the personnel that he wanted to bring in, and that was Levon Helm on the drums, and Spooner Oldham on the keys, and David Hood on bass, and Jim Dickinson's son Luther fronts the North Mississippi All-Stars on lead guitar.
Sure, I've heard of them. Yeah.
And so, I was amazingly excited and nervous also.
I can imagine. I if you don't mind, if I could interject, like when you started hearing these names we're going to be working with you, did you feel intimidated at all, or you knew you could hang with them? Or
well, there was a moment where I had to. Although I had been hearing David Hood played on When a Man Loves a Woman with Percy Sledge, and he played on Slim Harpo's Mohair Sam. These are recordings, that I was aware of from a very young age, and the idea that I was going to get to record with him was, it was both terrifying and exciting at the same time. And Spooner, he played on some of the earliest. David Hood and Spooner played on the earliest Aretha Franklin sessions, and I was a huge The Band fan. So Levon Helm was a hero of mine, But as I dug into, I wasn't totally aware of who they were. I left my initial discussion with Jim Dickinson with my notebook and had taken down all the names and started doing my research on who they were, and realized that I was getting to step into a recording studio and record with some of the giants of rock and roll, of the golden age of rock and roll.
Truly.
And, beyond just Levon and Jim, it was really and then, that's the contextual side of the answer to the question, which was, how did I lose the record? So I arrived in January of 2001, 15th and 16th and 17th of January of 2001. I arrived in Memphis at Sounds Unreal Studios. And we recorded those 3 days. And on the 18th, I returned to the studio, and it was like someone, the vibe of the room had completely changed. And as I walked in, folks told me that there had been a call from California from my label, and that there was some issue had come up, and that I needed to call them and all that. And so I got on the phone and found out that they had my record label at the time, which I was signed to a 6-record deal with them out in Los Angeles, they had, hit a financial iceberg, and were pulling up their assets wherever they could, and had ordered a stop to our sessions, and in short order, they went into a death spiral for, as a business, and over the next year and a half, they went Chapter 11, and those tapes became out of reach to me. I was fighting to get out of a 6-record deal, and it took me 3 years to get myself untangled from the 6-record deal that I had made. And by the time I got out of that, it was, the tapes were just out of reach to me. I had reached out to all the people involved to try and talk people into taking the tapes to a different label and get somebody else to buy the project out or whatever. A lot of it seemed to me at the time there were a lot of different possibilities, but nobody else saw that potential. And so the album, I had to accept. I came around to having to accept that it was gone, and all I was going to have as a souvenir that it had ever happened was an envelope full of black and white photos that my friend Hunter Bryce took. And over the years, I watched. I stayed in touch with Levon, and we always had plans of listening down to the record once we were able to get it and such. But he passed away, and then Jim passed away.
Oh.
And then in 2016, I think it was, I heard that Jack Holder, the owner of the studio where we recorded Sounds Unreal, he also passed away. Wow. He's a Memphis rock producer, and his studio had a temperature and humidity controlled vault where they kept all their 2-inch tapes. They had a library of them in there. Some really well-known albums and sessions. And so I when I heard that the studio was closing, I speculated that for certain those tapes are all going to be moved somewhere to a new spot. And I felt pretty confident that my tapes were among them. So I decided that it was now or never. It was time to make an interception, and I dug into the community of people that I know in Memphis and found Don Hopkins, who was Jack Holder's assistant back in the day when I worked that session. And I tracked her down and called her up out of the blue and said, "Miss Hopkins, you probably don't remember me, but I recorded an album at your studio back in 2001 with Levon Helm and Spooner Oldham and Jim Dickinson and David Hood." And there was a long silence, on the phone. And she said, "Of course, I remember that session. I know exactly where your tapes are."
Wow.
And she was kind enough to see my determination and my good intentions. The players that participated in the album were treated very poorly by the record label as it went, as it was going down, as it was collapsing. And there was a unresolved business to be settled around this album. And my intention has always been to try and make good on all that. So it weighed heavily on me for a lot of years that my record label had allowed the business to go down that way, and that I had lost the record. And so I wanted to clear up all of that, and I let Dawn know that when I called her and asked her for my tapes. I let her know that I'm on a trajectory, and my intent is to come to terms with all the people that were left hanging by my record label. And once I got the green light from Luther, she told me to come on down to Memphis and get my tapes, and that was in 2017.
Okay. And so when you say that those players weren't treated as well as they should have been by the label, they weren't paid for their time, or they weren't paid in full for their efforts.
They were totally stiffed by the
Wow.
record label. They were totally stiffed by the label. The record label paid out to the studio and the producer to make sure that they prevented lawsuits from those entities. Regarding the musicians. They completely stiffed them.
Wow. And as an aside, I know Levon Helm. Oh, go ahead.
The positive resolution to that is that 20 years later, during COVID, when nobody was working and nobody was making any money, and the future seemed so uncertain for so many people, my friend Dave Pomeroy, who's president of our local our musicians union down here, it's local 257 here in Nashville. I laid out the story of these tapes and my intention to like try and come to terms with all of the people and their surviving widows of the players on this album. And he played an active role in it. He kind of guided the situation to a resolution by getting on the horn to talk to all the interested parties, and who better to come to some kind of a fair resolution than the union president, whose primary interest is to defend the interests of musicians, right? Yes. He was able to explain to them all, like Mike is just one of us. He's just a musician, no longer has a label behind him. So we were able to come to amicable terms on we were able to come to a number that was doable for me, that everybody was willing to live with. And I got the green light out of all camps involved, which was really important to me karmically around this record, to make sure that was the case going forward.
That's fascinating. I'm glad to hear that. That's interesting that the tapes weren't your property at the time, and then when the record label dissolved, the tapes basically were in limbo, like they were nobody's possession. They just happened to live in that vault.
Well, they owed a lot of money on those tapes. And so when they liquidated,
right,
that was an asset that other whoever was picking over the assets of this company as they were going Chapter 11 didn't find that to be a particularly attractive piece of collateral, because it had this price tag associated with it. They incurred it was a sizable number, the number of dollars that were owed on these that they walked away from when they went Chapter 11. So anybody picking that asset up, that collateral up in the Chapter 11, would have had to settle all that, and nobody saw the value in it. So the ownership of the records, the tapes, basically came down to possession.
And hence you went in there and took what was yours.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. There's a lot of amazing records that get lost in the money grubbing incompetence of music business.
Yeah, well, I've definitely heard that. Is that your sense of it, without going too hard, unless you want to go hard? Is the music industry a place where a lot of those things occur? It's money first, and it's a lot of people getting screwed.
I think that when you get into the music business, the ethics that people operate under are, you better have eyes in the back of your head. Is the best advice that I can give you.
I think that says a lot. That says a lot. What's kind of been the reaction from some of the estates or the families that you've dealt with, like who played on the album that you're looking to get these reparations to, so to speak? Have they been? I'm sure they couldn't be more thankful or, appreciative.
It was all very gracious and civil and polite, and I hold each of them and their each of the people who played on the record I hold in the highest esteem and have, you know, for, you know, the bulk of my life. So, you know, I was coming from a place of high respect. And I think that it's hard for that not to be communicated. So everybody understood that I was coming from the right place, and they were all happy to receive what I was able to provide. And as far as any kind of additional support, you know, that's not something that I had any expectations for. And it's just really, for me, it's about setting the record straight.
Right.
You know, I've gone on to make a bunch of records since this happened in 2001. You know, I haven't sat around.
Right.
You know, although this was like leaving a pound of flesh in Memphis for me, and it impacted the trajectory of my life. It didn't prevent me from being creative and continuing my journey as an artist and making records. And so, although in the way that this record in 2001 played out may have limited the reach and scope of my music and my, you know, my capacity for focusing my life on music, because you have to financially and economically, you know, balance your life in such a way that your bills are covered, etc. And if you have to resort to any number of plan Bs to finance your stuff, then your energies are divided. And my energies have been divided my whole life. At least since 2001, you know, from up to that point, I was, you know, totally devoted and was all in with music. And after I hit that iceberg, I had to figure out how to survive. For years, I was in a contract I couldn't get out of with music. I couldn't proceed with music. I couldn't get in with other business people. And, you know, from there, I graduated to the era of independent music, the age of the independent musician. I put out a bunch of my own records with the help of my friends and other people that were coming up in sound engineering and trying to make their careers. That, you know, part of the wave of musicians that I'm a part of, that I came here in Nashville and met, you know, a community of people who continued to support me and helped me put records out every few years. And I've remained productive like that, but I always had to pay for it somehow, because, you know, the music business has been faltering. And unless you reach a certain level with your whole operation, you're constantly having to pay for it out of some other revenue stream or whatever, you know. And for me, you know, driving around in $200 cars back in the day, and it equipped me with a pretty good understanding of mechanics, and I've been able to develop the side thing of, you know, fixing people's cars. And, you know, my experience is pretty broad in that, but it was not what I was put here to do, and it's not what I find meaningful and fulfilling in life. But you know, it does pay for me to continue to be a musician. And you know, like these last few runs where I went up the East Coast and to the Midwest a little bit, you know, those are some of the first runs that I've gotten into the black, where I came home and broke even. I didn't lose money on them. I didn't have to subsidize myself out of mechanic money, you know. So it's, you know, figuring out how to survive and how to make the numbers work is always a tricky thing. And you know, for young musicians coming up, you need to understand that part of it. You know, like that's what record companies used to be for. They would get behind the artist and give them the elbow room to be 100% about music and writing and recording and touring and all that stuff. That kind of support from a business standpoint, that's not really what labels provide, even when you can find them these days. So musicians coming on to the scene need to sort of weigh all that shit out because it's important information to consider.
No doubt, no doubt. Do you see yourself maybe on the brink of the next chapter of your career where you can be maybe more music first and less of this subsidizing?
Well, that's always been the goal.
Right.
I'm putting myself out there and getting touring runs booked, and like I'm hoping to get back up into Canada at some point and play some shows up there. But I've got different regions of the country in my sights that we're getting out to, and
Cool.
some radio stations, some terrestrial stations are, as well as internet stations, are supporting the record, and we're getting lots of write-ups in press. So
Good.
I feel like the potential is there for me to keep it going, and I'm going into 2022 with the goal of hitting the festivals, getting some anchor dates, building club date runs around them, and keeping it moving forward and doing what makes me happy, which is playing music.
Beautiful. Well, that's awesome. I hope it works out for you. This is music that I think I don't want to sit here and tell you what it is, but Americana was a word that came to mind, but it's a music it appeals to a lot of different people, at least this album and your sort of brand of music.
Yeah, Americana is such a strange label, It used to be called roots music,
Okay.
it's a blend of folk music and blues and rhythm and blues and country and bluegrass and gospel and soul and all those American forms. And, I've always been a little, the title, the name has always seemed a little awkward to me, but
Sure.
anyway, at any rate, Americana or roots, blues rock or folk, I'm cool with all those.
And there's a taste of all those sort of genres that you mentioned on this album. I felt I'm kind of curious about what you came to Jim Dickinson with as far as demos or sketches or whatever, and how they helped you sort of, how much of that happened as far as like how we're going to produce this, what kind of feel can we put on this, like what was kind of your vision, I guess, early?
Well, I had made my first record, like I mentioned earlier, with Rodney Crowell, and I had showed up basically, like a street singer with a bunch of songs and maybe a few of them on, demo out in like a home studio setting where I got to do the way I wanted it to do, and what Rodney liked about my demo was it was so outside the box for Nashville. Nashville sometimes can have this sort of, at least our main, there's a lot of branches of the music scene here, but the big main one that gets projected across country radio all over the continent, that genre, modern country or whatever, I connected to country music through the roots, through the Willie Nelson and Hank Sr. and George Jones and from that side, and Johnny Cash, from that side of things. And so at any rate, that was the kind of sound that I wanted my records to be, right? And so working with Rodney, was my first go round, and coming out of that experience, there was things about it I loved, and there was things about it that I would have done different. And so I was going into that second record with Jim Dickinson in Memphis. I was going into that, really determined to like assert my vision on what I wanted the record to sound like. And I can't, it's hard for me to remember what exactly I was listening to at the time, but I'm sure it was like, I was listening to Rolling Stones. I was listening to, Fats Domino and Slim Harpo and Jimmy Reed and Howlin' Wolf. And I was listening to the band, and I was listening to the Staples, some little gospel. And I was immersed in New Orleans, in the New Orleans sort of soul, gospel, and jazz culture. And, all of those elements had soaked up into my songwriting consciousness. Yeah. And when I came to Jim Dickinson, I'm not sure that I had some basic demos, guitar, vocal demos, of some of the tunes. And then the rest of them were just like scrap pieces of ideas.
Gotcha.
And a melody and a chord progression. And I played them for him, and but they're straightforward. If you play that New Orleans stroll 6/8 strumming pattern, there's only really a few bass lines that go with that, and you start, and Jim instinctively knew how that one was going to sound, when we fleshed it out with the band, and so on, when we went through the list of songs. And that was, and as we went, he was like, I'm hearing there would be I'm hearing keys on that one, I'm hearing some singers.
Cool.
And I think that the choruses really need, like the horn section, and we sort of blueprinted the record this way. And unfortunately, we didn't get that deep into the actual tracking. We got 3 days and we got the basic band tracks off the floor, and we never, during Jim's lifetime, we never had the opportunity to finish it off with the horns and the singers like we had originally discussed. But when I reclaimed the tapes, or came into possession of them in 2017, my goal was to fulfill the original vision that he and I had discussed.
Okay, that's very interesting. I guess I was curious then, how much has gone into it since 2017? Like you're saying, you really just got sort of the off the floor tracks, and then the vocals and the horns are more recent additions. The
background vocals,
which are awesome, by the way.
Thank you. It's that is Gene Peterson, Lisa Oliver Gray, and Regina McCrary, some of the great singers here in Nashville, Tennessee, that have thrown their support behind me in the past, which is why I wanted to bring them all onto this project.
Cool.
But where were we? You were asking me about something.
I was just curious about what you got out of those initial sessions, and then what you ended up kind of adding once you reclaimed the tapes.
So once I had the tapes, and I made it back to Nashville, I took them to Ray Kennedy, who I had befriended, and who knew the process of baking the tape.
Okay.
Just like when they have been subject to 20 years of aging in an unknown environment, which it seemed, my impression was that these tapes were kept in a very temperature and humidity controlled environment. So it was the right kind of place. But you always, after tapes have been sitting that long, you always run them through this process that removes any moisture, because it can really ruin the tapes, So Ray did that. Then he gave it back. We were able to, and then he transferred them to digital, and I was able to take them to my a producer that I had worked with on my last record, Chad Brown, and we started to listen down to the stuff and spend some time listening to what we had, because there was multiple takes of each of these songs, on those tapes. Part of Jim Dickinson's process was we record each song 3 times, and then we'll pick the best take out of those 3, and that's the one that we'll use to build on. And so we went through that process with Chad, and then, there was a couple of songs there that I felt the tracks were lovely, and the band and everybody sounded great, but the underlying song, didn't reach the potential that it could have. This was like 2017, 2018, and the world is going through this collective trauma, I just felt like I waited 18 years to get my tapes back. So I felt within my rights to take artistic license to rewrite a couple of those tunes to reflect our modern collective experience, and that would be Layin' Low and Lord of the Fleas. Those 2 got totally rewritten to fit my mood of in 2018.
Okay. So that's interesting. And I was curious because even besides those two, a lot of this stuff feels as though it could have been written more recently. And then maybe that's just, humanity, it just has the same problems over and over that you kind of were tapped into and looking to try and solve in your way.
There is some of that, isn't there? I think that is Together is a song that deals face on, head on with this division in our society that's paralyzing division, where we're focusing constantly on the things that we disagree on instead of finding the common things that we do agree on and building on those. And I think that was already coming into focus for me when we originally recorded this in 2001. Our society was moving in this direction where we were once capable of great things, like putting people on the moon, or there's a long list of things that vaccinating people against polio, for instance, or vaccinating people against chickenpox. We used to be capable of doing great things as societies, and something has recently changed in these last few decades where visions have really driven us into our corners to the point where the common interest has been lost, because we're reflexively at odds with each other. At least, I'm speaking from my point of view here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it's like in Canada. I speak with my folks fairly regularly, and I know Canada struggles with some of the same issues, maybe with slightly less intensity than we are having here in the United States these days, with our capital being, raided by would-be revolutionaries, fascist persuasion. Mm-hmm. I don't know that type of thing has come to pass in Canada just yet, but this type of hysterical division and hatred of a fellow countryman. I don't remember that as being part of my experience in Canada. I left Canada when I was 20.
Okay.
To pursue my career in the United States, and I just don't remember it being that contentious. But I was young. Maybe it was there, and I just didn't see it.
Yeah, I know, right? Like maybe it was always there, and then as you get older and more, socially conscious, it becomes apparent. But I'm with you. I think it's reached a hysteria level. It's reached, like you say, not as bad in Canada, but we're on our way. There's a lot of, and I think social media is largely to blame, and institutional media too, the way it just focuses on differences and putting people into boxes.
It's unfortunate that conflict creates headlines, and disagreement is more exciting than agreement, consensus.
Yeah.
But it is really, for people of my age group, it's really quite something to look back at, an earlier time period that you read about in textbooks and maybe experience the tail end of, where we were capable of great things as nations. We were capable of great things at one time. And we are now like a turtle on its back, unable to like address the most basic realities of, and I know that in your part of the world, I know that the oil and gas and the climate and clean energy conversation is a very passionate and contentious one, because Alberta depends on the resource and has invested in this resource over decades, generationally, and it's a very tricky problem to wrangle. And I definitely empathy for the working class people that have hitched their wagon to that industry, so to speak.
Right.
But it's hard for people whose paychecks rely on that industry to understand that outside on the coasts, they don't have the luxury of pretending like climate change isn't happening, because the oceans are rising and testing their infrastructures. And in some cases, here in Tennessee, you would think it's kind of like a very unlikely place for climate change to show itself. And we had a town where a big rain here not too long ago, very unusual rain, 100 years, like
Sure.
like they're always saying, you know,
Right,
until they start happening every year, or every couple of years. But we had one of those big rains here in central Tennessee, and we just about washed away the town of Waverly. I mean, I'm talking, it swept away. The river busted the banks and came through the middle of town, and babies were being swept away from the arms of their mothers. I mean, this is happening right, you know, here in Tennessee. We are not anywhere near the coast. And so my whole point in going on to this little tangent is that, you know, as for our species and for our species to survive, or, you know, our civilization and the coastal cities that we have built that populate, I don't know what the statistic is, but the coastal cities on planet Earth populate something like 90 something percent of humanity. Like, I mean, it's pretty high. Mm-hmm. So if we have to be just displaced because of the ambitions and our needs for fuel and electricity, and our inability as a society to wrangle this question of clean energy and climate and move forward and start making the right infrastructure investments to transition to a cleaner energy, you know, it makes people of my age group and you know, I was born in 72. I'm getting to be an old timer now, but I remember, I'm looking back and I'm thinking to myself, you know, I got vaccinated when I went to school, to public school. There wasn't a choice. You didn't say, no, I don't feel like getting that the shot. Mm-hmm. Like, that wasn't how it was back then. And nowadays, anybody who can barely put a sentence together, you know, without, you know, like a dramatic grammatical
misstep
problems, is suddenly like bestowed with like the credentials to and the authority to say, you know, like, I don't agree with you know, vaccinating my child, or vaccinating children in general, or anybody for that matter, mm-hmm. against the pandemic. And it's just, I mean, I don't mean to take our conversation in that direction, but it relates to why the songs on Burning the Bigtop Down were relevant 20 years ago, and they're still relevant today. That's what it relates to.
No doubt. And tangents are welcome on this show. I appreciate you saying all that. I worry that I mean, I'm not ever going to deny climate change or anything like that. I worry that this, in the same way that COVID was dealt with in the media, that this sort of alarmism and hysteria about climate change, we risk not even seeing the problem for what it is at that point, and not coming to any solution.
It is, you know, there are a lot of competing interests that need to be balanced, and it needs to be balanced with I feel like the only way forward is to find an equitable balance to make a transition. Now that opens up the question, well, how do you wind things down with the industry and the people that are dependent on the industry? And, you know, I think that, you know, it would be rational to talk about how, you know, our Amazons and our billionaires of the world could potentially contribute to, you know, a scheduled drawdown, so that the shareholders and stockholders in these industries don't lose everything. I mean, it seems reasonable as a society, once again, we can pull in the same direction and agree, well, okay, these guys have been investing in this infrastructure for 100 years. We don't want them to lose everything. They should really be the leaders in the new energy, but they've become embedded and intractable because they're determined to squeeze out the last dollar they can out of their investment. Well, that's understandable, but as a collective society, we, you know, the only fair way, if we either abandon them, leave them holding the bag and everything that they've invested in the industry, you know, or we collectively understand that we can't leave people and whole sectors of our population behind, and organize ourselves in such a way that the power of our government and our private institutions is brought to bear on some kind of, you know, scheduled drawdown or transition over the coming years. You know, I think that that's reasonable, but I think that when you throw that on the floor, it becomes red meat to the most hysterical and unproductive voices in the conversation. That's unfortunately where we are. You can't have an adult conversation in a state of hysteria.
That's you said it well. You said it well. You can't have that conversation anymore, and that's worrisome. What occurred to me listening to your album was that you kind of do, in some ways, propose a solution that to me seems like love and understanding and collectivism. Is that accurate? Is that fair to say?
Collectivism is a term that I'm a little uncomfortable with. Sure. Because it can be used against you. But I do feel a deep connection to FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt's perspective on how modern democratic governments are supposed to work, and that a nation cannot be healthy if it leaves behind broad swaths of its people to live in abject poverty and have their needs unmet. Right. That is not how, now do I subscribe to collectivism? I mean, there's a lot of different interpretations of the word collectivism. I believe that it's a moral failure of our socioeconomic system that we have billionaires and we have families that can't get drinking water, or access to education or healthcare. I mean, that is the rules of the road. That is the state of affairs down south of the border. I can't speak for Canada. Yeah, it's been a lot of years since I lived up there, but I think that it's one of the weak links in our world. Our entire house of cards. Right. The structure of our society and government is that the super wealthy and industries have gotten to a point where they exert so much influence on policy, on public policy. Right. The broad swaths of the public are consequently impacted in a negative way, and policy has been turned inside out on itself to where the wealthy and the industries get to walk away without putting their fair share on the table. And the long-term effects of that economic equation are only now beginning to show themselves in the United States, where lack of access to education and healthcare has become widespread. Yeah. It's widespread. It's pan-American. It's all across the nation. And where in the 1950s and 60s and 70s there was a growing middle class, now there's a shrinking middle class, and more of the tax burden is being put on them because more of the billionaire class are walking away and finding loopholes and to evade their civic duty. Mm-hmm. So do I believe in collectivism? I share FDR and Eleanor's vision, and that is the only way that these systems that we have created in the West will survive. Is if we reach some kind of equitable, we define the parameters for these corporate. Back in the day, they called them the trusts. Okay, so they had to define new boundaries for the trusts, so that industry is welcome to profit and do what they need to do to profit. But when their profit making model starts to infringe upon the public good and the public interest, like, say, for example, dumping some toxic substance into the river as part of their, we're going to save a few dollars this way. Sure. That shouldn't really have a place at the table in our modern economy. And so, am I a collectivist? I don't know about that, but I do believe that the power of our government and our taxes should be applied to make sure that every child has access to education and nutrition and the basics of life, and that seniors, don't have to spend their last days under the bridge somewhere. I do think that in wealthy nations that should not exist. We should not have that kind of a struggle for the basic standards of life. And I think that in Canada, for whatever problems it has that it's wrangling with at any given moment, can be thankful that it is not as deeply mired in this conversation about how much our government should really be doing for the people, and how much the government should bend to the will of private industry and all these things. Like, for my impression of Canada as a Canadian who left when I was young, has always been that the Canadian cultural experiences, people can, I think that there's some greater degree of agreement on the idea that government is not supposed to be the instrument of industry and the billionaires. It's just not supposed. That's not how it's supposed to work. It's supposed to work for people. Good governance, I suppose. And anyway, we've really gotten sidetracked into politics and philosophy here, but
that's
at any rate,
what I could have hoped for.
I think that there's parallels in our times to FDR's and Eleanor's time. There's parallels, the excesses of industry, the inroads they have made in government to craft policy that suits them. That's not necessarily in the public interest. Like, for example, subsidies for oil and gas here in the United States are to the tune of $20 billion a year, and I didn't agree to pay for that. I didn't agree. And like, the public subsidies for military industrial stuff here is like half of the money we contribute to the national thing here in the United States goes towards aircraft carriers and helicopters and battleships. And we've got old people that don't know how they're going to keep a roof over their heads. Our seniors, our elders that we should be taking care of, And so there is always these questions, and there'll be people that hurl the ugliest insults at you if you think that, if you suggest that our priorities are a little bit mixed up,
Yeah, no, definitely. What you're talking about, this compassion, really actually takes courage to put forth. I think these days, I think what you say about the military and subsidizing large industry, like, it tells you all we need to know. I really, part of me worries that it's over. Like, I do appreciate you illuminating and highlighting the issues for what they are, but do you ever throw your hands up and feel that it's over, it's bought and paid for, and perhaps even some of the things that you mention in these songs? I don't mean to trivialize it, but even in Desdemona, that's kind of that final moment on the album. It's going back inside to the self, and finding just a love and a sort of simple life, in a sense.
It's interesting that you picked up on that. That song is about escapism, and I ended the record with that song, partially because of the exhaustion that I felt after years of being active, socially active. I was in the environmental world. There was a company here impacting my community in a very negative way and forcing their way to expand their infrastructure, et cetera. And I got through that experience. I spent my weekends I spent a lot of time figuring out where their infrastructure crossed public waterways here in Tennessee. And then I would make time on weekends to get out to those waterways and photograph their infrastructure and the condition that it was in. And it was in bad condition. And this was a company that gets whatever they want. They're accommodated by the federal government to expand, and regardless of how the community feels about it. And so with part of their PR, they talk about being a real good neighbor and all these things. And my photographs and the report that I put together and submitted at all levels of local and state and federal regulatory agencies, the appropriate ones, indicated that they may not have been, in fact, the responsible neighbor that one would assume after reading their pamphlets and paper and promotional material. But I became very deeply involved in the effort to confront pipeline expansion, pipeline infrastructure expansion, not only in my community here in Tennessee, but also in Standing Rock.
Oh yeah.
In solidarity with the Native American community across the continent, but in particular the Sioux Nation.
Sure.
I led several fundraising events here in Nashville, Tennessee, and my community, which was also locked in a protracted battle with the pipeline infrastructure company here, felt a great deal of empathy and solidarity with the community of Standing Rock. And so I had the great honor of being the man who drove the rig with our material support, which was, the people from Tennessee donated winter camping gear, crates of potatoes and cabbage, and live pigs. I brought out seven live hogs to the camp in Standing Rock. And at any rate, I like I said, I was very deeply involved in that moment of activism, and my report reached media across the nation, and I actually sent quite a few copies to Canada as well, because it had to deal with a specific company that was set to receive $6 billion in public subsidies for a very contentious pipeline project in Canada. And I thought that my photographs of their rusting and deteriorating infrastructure here might be relevant in the conversation in Canada. They're about to give $6 billion in taxpayer money to this company. And when I did share my photographs in Canada, particularly in Alberta, I was roundly attacked by a large group of oil and gas workers, for my work and for my effort to interfere with the taxpayer handout that they had somehow finagled, which was very disappointing, I must say. All through the Trump years, everybody here was looking at Justin Trudeau saying, why can't we have a guy who's like at least not an animal? Animals. I love animals. Why can't we have a guy who at least respects the basics of decorum, of social and public decorum, right?
Sure.
And it was a real deep disappointment to see him accommodate the pipeline and gas pipe, this American company that came up there and got $6 billion in taxpayer handouts. It was a disappointing decision, because I remembered hearing him speak about climate issues and how the Canadian government Canada had a role in showing the way, showing leadership in this great clean energy transition. But you can't make everybody happy. So he doesn't owe me anything, and I know that he's made a lot of people upset up there on both sides of the table. So who knows? Maybe he knows something we don't.
Oh, definitely. But he's falling further and further out of popularity. I mean, he just got reelected last month with 30% of the vote. Like he's hated in large communities, large groups.
He's mishandled some things, but I can imagine he's not a very popular figure. When I speak with my folks in Halifax, they're not big fans of his, that's for sure. So I understand, and I'm sure that the taxpayer handout was not the only mistake that he made during his tenure. Nope. But I came away from that experience in the environmental movement. We lost here. We passed local. There was a compressor station, a 60,000 horsepower compressor station coming to my community, with emissions like a small airport going 24 hours a day. And my photographs weren't able to. What I learned was they dispatched the the Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration inspectors came up here from Atlanta to Nashville to look at some of the backcountry sites we had identified where the pipelines were in terrible shape. Mm-hmm. And we were, making small talk with them, and I wanted to make sure that they understood how deeply we appreciated them making the journey from Atlanta to come look at our rusting pipelines here in Tennessee. I said, I know you guys are spread thin in personnel and funding and all that, and thank you for making time for us here in Tennessee. And he said, well, it's a common misconception that we get our funding from the tax base. We actually get our funding from the pipeline operators themselves, based on the volume of material that moves through the pipelines. So it suddenly dawned on me that a rusting pipeline, or one that looked to be in poor condition and potentially like a public safety consideration, that was a threat to Pipeline Hazardous Material Safety Administration, which is our pipeline regulator here in the U.S. It's a threat to their revenue. And this is where I got a peek behind the curtain about how all these things work down here. I'm sure it works a little bit differently up there, but not soon thereafter, the community that the reason I had gotten involved in our community effort was this was like 2016, and people from all sides of the political spectrum were coming together in our community to fight, to stick up for our community, because they didn't want the creeks that their kids play in to be potentially subject to some kind of toxic impact. Right. The air that they're breathing, all in this community, all around this compressor station, which, like I said, 60,000 horsepower compressor station operating 24 hours a day with blowdowns and stuff. It impacts it. We conducted a study here. It impacts the air quality, and families on both sides of the political spectrum, and all over the political landscape kind of came together to fight for their community on this thing. And I was like, well, I want to be a part of that. Yeah. That right there is like in a microcosm of how we fix some of this division that has grown in our society right there by coming together to stick up for our communities. Yeah. And so I became involved in that. And then, Standing Rock happened and our community supported them. And then I came back from there and Trump was elected. And shortly thereafter, I noticed that, in my own community and the same communities that had the signs, our signs out there, the no pipeline compressor station signs, that a whole bunch of those households now had MAGA signs in their yards also. And I realized that the community that I have been fighting for so hard supports policies that would do away with people like me. I'm a partially my dad is Spanish. Okay. I'm a tree hugger, and I'm an immigrant in the United States. I'm Canadian, and it's just on and on and on. I mean, I'm not a college graduate, thank goodness. I'd really be in trouble then.
No doubt.
But the point being, I started to realize that when you stick your neck out and fight for a community, you should be real sure about who it is and who they are, and because people. It's an important thing to consider, who you make alliances with. And at this point, I came away from the experience feeling like, they want a pipeline, let them have a pipeline.
Sure. No, that's an interesting kind of revelation there, right? And I've talked to some friends who are activists in their sort of social media presence, and after a while they're completely traumatized and burned out and exhausted, because it's and the word is emotional labor or whatever. It's you can't put the community on your back, truly. I mean, you can try, but
my feelings on that is this our future depends on young people and their idealism. The old people, and the older you get in life, the more hard you set in your position and your ways, and the more intractable. And the only idealism that is being injected into the equation is the new people that are coming up. So we can hold the line. We can hold the line on environmental stuff. We can hold the line on military intervention, or otherwise a prevention of unnecessary military intervention with anti-war protests. We can hold the line on, the erosion of women's rights in this country. We can hold the line on the erosion of immigrant rights. We can hold the line on minority rights and police reform and all these things. But eventually we need reinforcement, because people get burned out, and people are fighting a losing battle constantly. And the courage that it takes to go into battle when you know you're going to get whooped is twice the courage that it takes to go into battle when you know you're going to win. So
you see it as a battle?
I do. Yeah. I see it as a battle for the future. I mean, within a limited scope. I mean, I'm not talking about. I'm not bringing my howitzer to the fucking conversation. You know what I mean?
Yes, like, it's a battle of ideas
within the bounds of decorum and the spirit of inclusivity, and that each person's perspective matters, and there's a place at the table for everybody in the conversation. Unfortunately, democracies are vulnerable in this way. When you create an inclusive society, sooner or later somebody's going to sit down at the table that says, I don't like that guy.
Right.
No, I don't like that guy either. And I don't like this other person over here. And you know what I mean? Like, so balancing the ideals with the realities is always going to be tough. But from my point of view, I feel like part of my thing is you show up in solidarity with communities that you support when you're emotionally strong enough to be there, because you can't always be there. People need to recharge, and it's overwhelming. Like the odds that good things are going to happen. It's an overwhelming statistic, right? Okay. But we have made progress. Like, I can give you an example here. In Tennessee, the country was collectively traumatized by watching George Floyd be choked to death for 10 minutes, right? And here in Tennessee, we still had the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest. You know who he is? He was a Confederate cavalry general who was a slave trader before the war, and he was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. And we have a statue of that man's likeness we had in our state capitol for all those years. I don't know when they put it in, but it's been here the whole time I've been here.
Wow.
I think it went in, if not immediately after the war, then at some point, it would be interesting to know when it went in. But that's the first thing that visitors to our state capitol see, is the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Well, after a year of trauma, based on George Floyd and the resulting outrage in the community, this statue was finally removed this year.
Wow.
This year. And I feel like Tennessee is a little bit behind other states in that regard. And that happened because some people stayed on it, and they didn't go home in exhaustion and disgust and hopelessness and throw their hands up in there. And some of them did, but there were young people that came up behind them that were fully energized, that were like, if you need to go recharge and self-care and all those things, go, I've got it. I'll hold this section of the line right here, you know? I mean, metaphorically speaking, but without that, I see, do I think it's over? I have to remain that it's hopeful that human consciousness and enough people having consensus on certain issues can move the ball forward. I have to believe that, that it's not always going to be like a tiny minority of bigots or, people that are financially interested in an industry that get to exert their power and control over totality of our democracies. I have to believe that we hold the line and do the best that we can and show up and be there in solidarity with each other across communities, that we can make progress. But I'm an idealist, I'm a songwriter, and that's just,
sure.
They go together. But I've been proven wrong in the past. I still have hope, and I don't think that there's any other choice. And so, yeah, I don't ever want to say a discouraging word to the young kids that might be fired up to stick up for, the rights of, people to not be killed in a police interaction, for the rights of other countries to have policies that the West disagrees with, that like Afghanistan or Iraq, for example. Not to say that, who am I to judge, what price needed to be exacted for 9/11 from that, that desert country that has no infrastructure to begin with, was rubble before we got there. Right. But, if we stop showing up, if we collectively as a society were to say, yeah, let the oil and gas guys drill and build pipelines, let the military guys call another war in some other part of the country where, some other part of the world where they have a perceived interest, or let the police murder or abuse our fellow citizens. They probably had it coming to them. If we succumb as a society to this type of thinking, yes, it's lost.
Okay.
But as long as the young kids come that were raised on the right values of fairness and equality and trying to move our societies forward in that direction to make it a fairer and better experiment in representative democracy, I think that there's still hope. And that's the side of it I come down on, and I want to be hopeful about it.
Wonderful. That all makes sense. I appreciate you laying it out. I wonder if in some ways now we're in a time where this discussion is pitched, like it's reached a fever pitch of hysteria, and social justice and this activism that you're talking about is pushing hard. And I guess it's like we have to push that hard to make just a little bit of ground. So it may feel excessive to someone like me who's less, socially inclined, but to make a small step, you really need to push hard, it seems like.
Like this comes down to the differences between living in Canada and the United States, I think,
Sure.
Because I know that Canada has like a unique set of challenges that it's facing as a country, and they relate and mirror what is happening in the United States. But I feel like there are parts of what's happening here in the United States that are unique, and
okay.
And to where, for example, the idea that the justice system and the prison system can be privatized. Mm-hmm. and made into a profitable business operation based on the incarceration of our fellow Americans, and based on
Sure.
a contract that the state of Florida, say, for example, guarantees the Corrections Corporation of America that they stay 95% at capacity, right? At 95% capacity. This is a fundamental aberration of free market capitalism, in my view. But what do I know? Wow. I believe that there are limits. There are certain things that it's fair game to profiteer on some things, mm-hmm. but something that affects the public interests that heavily, which you're literally putting a price on somebody's freedom. I feel like that is where our system of accommodating business could use a Rooseveltian moment.
Sure.
It could use like FDR to step in and say, we need to rein this in and make sure that it's not negatively impacting the public interest. Because, if you're just like got your army of lobbyists working in every state house across the country to guarantee that certain things remain criminal or whatever, so that your profit margin stays high and all that's like that is not necessarily the values that a democracy should be espousing. Like that's where democracy and profiteering sort of come into conflict. And that in my view is sort of like an example of the difference between life in America and life in Canada. I think that Canada has managed to, for whatever way or whatever reason, whatever projection it is of the public will, or if it's a fluke, it just happened that way, I don't know, but there's some fundamental differences between Canada and the United States in this philosophical question of like how far can an industry go in terms of impacting the public in a very negative way before they are held to account. And here there, as we can see on a regular basis, there's virtually no accountability for these companies.
No accountability. Yeah, I mean, maybe we're just 100 years behind in Canada, and we'll get there eventually. We'll soon be paying for our healthcare and keeping prisons full to make profit. It could be. And
I think that it's the as flawed as it is, the healthcare access to healthcare for Canadians is such that a cancer patient, somebody who got a diagnosis of cancer and has no healthcare insurance in place, doesn't necessarily lose everything they've worked for their entire lives. Where in the United States, a similar thing happens, you're done. You lose everything. You're like in perpetuity,
forever. Yeah.
I don't know how that, I mean, obviously you declare Chapter 11 or you go into bankruptcy and you start over at some point, but I don't know that the law allows for you to start off without creditors basically staying on top of you the rest of your existence on this earth. And not only that, it spreads to your family and things.
Yeah.
So I feel like there's certain parts of the Canadian socioeconomic contract, though, that as flawed as they are, if industries are allowed to replace them and privatize them, Canada will in short order find itself in a situation the United States is in, where the profiteering side of the thing will be prohibitive, and our grandmothers won't be able to see the doctor, and all these things will start happening. Families will start carrying like a massive a burden of bills whenever their loved ones have to need medical attention or treatment or these things, and that's something to protect, I think.
Oh, I agree. I've been thinking about, too, an issue that often goes under the radar is human trafficking and child trafficking. And to me, that's a great sort of metaphorical or allegorical look at the way that big institutions like, whatever you want to say, oil and gas, media, you name it, use human energy as fuel, and the individual human sovereignty and life is seen as not as valuable as it should be. And it's, you know what I'm saying here? Like legions and masses of people just giving themselves away and being used. And the fight that you're talking about, I think, is fundamentally a fight, for human sovereignty in a way.
It's such a complicated issue, this idea of human sovereignty, and of course, how can I not be in solidarity with anybody who says, you see this little circle of space around my shoes, that's my territory. That's, like, don't violate my space and step into this territory. Well, I see it all down the line, though.
Right.
There's some people who feel like their sovereignty is more important than others, or they're using their position of respecting their sovereignty as a way to defend their own interests, while supporting policies that erode other people's sovereignty, like what's happening right now in the United States with women's access to reproductive health.
Sure.
It's being criminalized in states like Texas and will be soon copied in other states that have Republican supermajorities in their state houses. And, I'll put it this way. I stand in solidarity with all my fellow human beings in the struggle of life. But the ones that are trying to undermine somebody else's sovereignty are people that I exclude from that solidarity. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And so I feel like going forward, it's trying to repair some of the damages and come together and focusing on things that we agree on is really truly imperative. And it has to get past the propaganda that, like, oh, climate change is just a liberal hoax.
Sure.
Or, the echo of that was COVID is just a liberal hoax. And it also, there's a part of me that has seen, the abuses of the oil and gas industry, the anti-democratic abuses when they want to move into a neighborhood. And I feel like in a pitched battle, I have no in a pitched legal battle or whatever, struggle with them I have no empathy from them. But when I step back from the situation and look at the millions, hundreds of thousands, at least, workers that depend on that industry for their survival, I have a little bit more compassion for what they're feeling. And I start to understand the complexities of the situation, where it's not just investing in the new infrastructure. It's like how I'm from Nova Scotia. When the fisheries collapsed, there were hundreds of thousands of people that were essentially left behind in our economy, and they had to move west to work in slaughterhouses and things. And they had to adapt to the new thing. They had to adapt to the new thing when there was a moratorium on cod. They had to adapt. And so I feel this empathy for the oil and gas sector in this question of climate change and clean energy transition. And I also feel for I don't like a gas executive, but I feel like our society has used their products, and we collectively have to come together to figure out a way to do this kind of a scheduled drawdown, so that the oil executive who's been acting anti-democratically in some communities, so that guy doesn't get shafted at the end of the day either. And, I don't have a whole lot of empathy for them, but I see that the reasonable way to resolution for this involves them in the conversation. And their interests have to be met too, because in our social contract, their interests are more important than ours. Unfortunately, I reject that notion.
Me too.
It's clear, but it's not just one person, and it's all these shareholders, and it's their families, and then it's their workers, and all these things. And the industry has to be, can't just unfortunately, the flip side of that is the industry will drag its heels indefinitely, given the luxury of doing that. Right. So, I know it's a complex issue, and that's not what we really came here to talk about. But it is an issue that's at the forefront of my mind, and it's a major issue that we're wrangling with down here south of the border. And we're very happy to see clean energy infrastructure whenever it pops up around us, and we support it wholeheartedly. Because of some of the tariffs that Mr. T put on China, we have it has severely interrupted the supply side of the clean energy infrastructure. And the solution to that is that we should be manufacturing that stuff here, right? I mean, that's the obvious, the logical conclusion. But are we? We're not, because our industries are geared towards fossil fuels. So that therein lies a bit of a conundrum.
Right. Oh, 100%. I like what you're saying, though, that fundamentally it has to be a collaboration between everybody. And it's kind of, the old thing, like the activist kid tweeting from his iPhone about, defund the police or whatever. It's like there's some irony there that the solution may be in the problem too, but it is tough to force a massive multinational conglomerate to do anything that it doesn't want to do.
The market is the only thing that can move that, so that the industries on the clean energy side have their work cut out for them. And with each city or nation that declares by 2030 or 2035, we're going to be generating 50% or 70% of our power with clean energy. With each new breakthrough of a clean energy investment, the costs associated go down, and the price per barrel of oil stays a little bit more stagnant there in the middle, where it's been for a real long time. They're having a nice little bump right now. It looks good for them as the world comes back online after COVID, and power to them, whatever.
Sure.
But the commodity has been stagnant between 55 and 65 for many, 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 many years. Hard to get returns when the situation is like and that's where clean energy investment has dynamic growth. And it could be argued for hours where the smart money goes.
It could.
Some people would say the smart money stays on oil because they've got a stranglehold on public policy, public energy policy, and they will never make space for clean energy innovation. And then on the other side, somebody could argue that the smart money's on clean energy because oil and gas has been stagnant between 55 and 65 a barrel for 20 years. And, clean energy investment is dynamic growth. So
sure.
There's a lot of facets to the conversation. And I know that I'm sorry that we got so deep into that part of it. No. I felt like because you're in Edmonton, there was an extra sort of little bit of relevance in that aspect of any conversation with me.
No, I'm happy to hear all that stuff. Part of my kind of mandate with this show is to not get into any sort of argument and just to hear the guest out. I'm not going to debate you on any of this. You thought a lot about it, way more than I have. I think I like what you're saying, that clean energy, truly there's more of a ceiling for growth there, whereas oil is slowly stagnating. Plus it's non-renewable. It's going to be gone someday. I don't know when that day is coming, but you'd think that the companies and the market would be more driven towards clean energy. But again, on the flip side, I would just say in Calgary and in Edmonton this week, we elected new mayors, and they're both very progressive. And the mayor in Calgary, immediately she said her first mandate is to declare a climate crisis. And I worry how much at a municipal level can be done. I would hate to see us fall into this sort of hysteria where we're guilting people for their carbon output and their fossil fuel consumption versus a real pragmatic solution that looks at collaboration. And slow drawdown too is something that intrigues me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the scheduled drawdown is a long-term solution, but getting people to agree to something like that is, I don't know how that could ever come about. There would have to be, the public support would have to be there to understand that in order for us to make this energy transition and completely rearrange our energy portfolio, we have to work in partnership and on a scheduled drawdown, and taxpayers will be contributing to something like that. If otherwise, we just, you're giving shareholders a schedule, say, okay, you're only going to get 80% of the taxpayer subsidies next year. And then the year after that, you'll only get 60% of the taxpayer subsidies. And the year after that, you'll only get 40% of it. And it kind of gives them a time frame to get their money out of the industry so they don't get caught holding the bag. That to me makes sense. But, the more inclusive the conversation, the harder it is to make progress. And the more real leadership is required, and visionary leadership is what's required at this moment in time. I don't want to sound dogmatic. It's an issue that I've been involved in so deeply that I feel very passionately about it. But like I said, I empathize with any blue collar family out there that works those long hours and are separated, geographically, and have to keep their fingers crossed that they're and try and maintain this exterior of disbelief that climate change is even a real thing. You have to really go into a lot of contortions at the end of the day to pretend on the just like COVID. Yeah. People want to pretend that COVID isn't happening. At the end of the day, that becomes a really heavy brick to carry. And I think that one of the important things in the whole conversation is inclusivity is the way forward. We have to hear each other out and figure out what makes sense for the totality of our, so that we're not leaving segments of people behind, because that's what undermines the stability in a nation. And it's happening in a big way down here south of the border. And I feel like Canada's in a better position to prevent the worst that type of thing. We're really struggling with it down here.
Yeah, no doubt. And your population is 10 times what ours is. So I guess the stakes are higher, or the complexity of the discussion is more so.
Well, and the consumption of fossil fuels is more so.
Sure.
Also, like when you said that you got a couple of progressive mayors and you're not sure how, like, locally, what kind of impact can really be made on a local level like that. But there's truly, there's some cities here in the United States that are, they're implementing new codes, in building codes that require, semi-permeable runoff areas, and there's a whole spectrum of new construction techniques that maximize the energy potential that you're consuming, and implementing those in government buildings to start with, and school buildings, and green roofs, and these types of things are making a dent in local economies like Portland, or in Seattle, and forward-thinking communities, where they have progressive mayors that are making these. Of course, the scale of it is small and local. If it was a governor, or in the case of Canada, a premier that was implementing, province-wide changes, that would be bigger, larger scale. And we're talking about, all of the lights around the highway being run by solar panels instead of having gas burning somewhere to power those lights.
Sure.
Small changes like that eventually add up to something.
That's interesting too. I've thought about that as, I guess, less lately, but it is on the level of, like, the grassroots or the local, where any change really would start. Like, we talk about these massive issues, and, like, really, to me, the first step is just to have conversations like this, and to make awareness of an issue first and foremost.
Yeah, and taking stock of what's already been done. Like those mayors that just got elected. Where is that? In Edmonton and Regina?
Calgary.
Those mayors, if that's one of their goals, they have plenty to look at in terms of, like, what's already been achieved on a municipal level in not just in the United States. I mean, there are other countries that are innovating on clean energy, on the clean energy paradigm. And I believe that it should be top down. The leadership should be coming from
Sure.
top down, but that's not really how it works anymore in our world. It's communities influencing their local elected representative, and then the local representative showing good leadership and getting good results, setting an example for the next level up. In our case, it would be a state, a governor or governor's administration, using a town as a model. Like, yeah, that really worked well. It saved the town money. Let's reproduce that, use that as a template, and implement it all across the state, and see what we can do. That's how that's how things are moving forward now. I think that top down, it's unrealistic, I think, in our times, to expect real leadership change to come from the top down.
I fully agree. I think maybe we've always, but for sure right now, we're in some sort of a leadership crisis, where those that we elect to lead really don't lead anything except us to our demise, maybe, or us. You know what I mean? Like, I don't see it as leadership. I mean, maybe the mayor, maybe the councillors. I mean, but not even, like, maybe even in business. I think everyone's personal interest seems to come first, and ego is at an all-time high. Like, it's not leadership.
I would agree that to a certain level, and here's where my idealism kicks in, because I believe in the energy of and the drive of young people. And this is, I don't know how old you are, but I'm getting to be on there a little bit. So you look to me to be at least maybe 10 years younger than me. And I feel like there are a lot of dinosaur ideas, like this idea down here, like segregation, for example, or a woman has her place. These are ideas that only knuckle draggers espouse and they're dying off. But they're passing this idea along to their children whenever they can.
Right.
So the ideas themselves will have a longer shelf life than the people that are espousing them. But they are old ideas. They're worn out. They're from a different era, and they're going away, and they're being replaced by younger minds like yourself, who have had access to information on a level that no other generation has had. Like we can get on our computer and see how the life of a working man in the Crimea or in Zimbabwe. We can take a reading on all these. We have more information than ever. So young people coming into the world now are the fuel that is going to fuel positive change. I mean, it's just not going to happen from an older mindset, because the fossil fuel era and the post-World War II stability been squandered.
Yeah.
We could have had 500 years of prosperity, but all of that has been squandered. And, there's new thinking coming into play that doesn't include ideas like, I think with every generation we move forward, like the young kids nowadays, they see color less than any other generation. That's, like the little ones go to school with, and maybe that'll change. Maybe they'll have, some kind of biases, and, the racism and bigotries of the world will be taught to them over the years. And, they'll lose that innocence and purity that they have as children, but not all of them. And these ideas about discriminating against people because they're LGBT or because they're some minority or whatever, or that I deserve to get paid more for this job because I'm a man and she's a woman, or all these ideas are gradually showing themselves to be the ideas they're irreconcilable with the values of fairness and equality in our system. And I think that with each generation we get a little bit closer. And, it gives me hope to talk to younger people all the time, because I know that I'm not alone. I might've been, viewed as, some kind of, outlier in my time. But I think that the ideas of fairness and equality across the board, across the spectrum, and access to, education and healthcare and all these things, these are ideas that are becoming more and more popular, and because young people that are educated and have a wider worldview see them as the only way for advanced civilizations to move forward. And eventually that will be the paradigm we live in.
Yeah.
I believe this. We might not see it in our lifetime, but we, collectively keep pushing towards that, and we'll get somewhere.
No, that's well said. And it is kind of mirrors what you were saying earlier, that it just does take that constant pushing, and it's going to take a long, long time maybe to get there. I'm all for those, I guess, more liberal values of fairness and equality.
It's a dirty word in Canada.
Oh, it is. Yeah,
here too, though.
I wish there was a better one to use, but it's something like compassion or humanism, I guess. But I just worry that when it radicalizes, it really does the same thing. It becomes fascist, or it becomes tribal. Like there's a balance to be struck, but because I think truly the people that aren't as socially active, it could just be out of ignorance. Like just as an aside, I do some work as a news cameraman, and I was talking to a reporter on Monday, and I said, don't you think the issue is that people just don't understand the issues? And he said 100%. That's the problem. So it's not a left-right thing necessarily. It's a place of understanding and a place of ignorance that maybe that's the gap we ought to bridge.
I mean, there's a lot of bridges to gap there.
Sure.
Like access to education is a real stumbling block here. There are people here in this country who don't. If you brought up that the Civil War was about slavery, they would say, no, it wasn't. That was about states' rights.
Right. And
you're like, yeah, the state's right to have slaves. And they're not really taught that the lost cause was about slavery in some of these states. And so if you're not given the real history, how can you grow up to have like a sort of accurate perspective on what our what this moment in time really means, right? If you don't have like a clear vision on what that moment in time in history was all about, how can you really have a clear point of view on what's happening today? And I think that, this idea of access to education and information, it really touches everything that we've talked about today, from climate change, fossil fuels, clean energy, to the social injustices in racism or bigotry, or women being stripped from their bodily autonomy, and having their rights rolled back. All of these things are related to that. The only way you can be on board with some of these issues is if you just you've not been exposed to the right information. I mean, it's really the only way you can be on board with some of these ideas,
100%. And I think the more ignorant you are, like you say, unexposed to these issues for whatever reason, then you're pretty easy to control and be made a pawn in the interest of somebody else.
And we've seen that happen. That has played itself out over the last number of years here. I mean, so it's a real, you get to see the results, the immediate results of having reduced the access of education and information and stuff like that to certain constituencies. And you can, within a generation, see the results of that, somebody who can be claiming to be a patriot, whose patriotism is bigger than yours, says his patriotism is bigger than yours, and he's going to take his flag and he's going to go bash some security guard at the Capitol over the head with his patriotism, and go maybe even, urinate in the hallway in there, or break some furniture or something. And that's how much of a patriot he is. How did he get to be that kind of patriot? I think somebody led him along the way.
Yes. Maybe you can help me with that one, Mike. My understanding was that with that January 6th debacle, first and foremost, okay, there was some recent news that came out a few months ago where there was a lot of unnamed actors in that group that were probably intelligence. This January 6th thing was somewhat of a controlled movement that was sort of maybe with some bigger. Are you familiar with any of that? I don't think it was a dozen wackos that just decided.
I'm waiting to hear what information comes out of the investigation, because the fact that the Capitol Police called for backup several times, and that there were people up higher in the chain of command that said no. That leads me to believe that there was more people participating in this plan and the implementation of this plan. And beyond that, what's even more interesting to me, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing more about, is that the Republican Attorney General's Conference, RAGA, is a consortium of 18 attorneys general. The highest law officers in the 18 states concerned are Hubert Slattery of Tennessee is our attorney general. He's among them.
Okay.
They contested the results of the election. They contested, those attorney generals, highest law officers in the state of Tennessee and 17 other states, RAGA, contested the election, implemented robocalls to gain funds for what happened on January 6th, to plan, to organize. Our Republican Attorney General's Conference was in on that whole business, the fundraising and the promotion and all of that. And, at some point, Steve Bannon or Michael Flynn or one of those fascists is going to say, well, yeah, I mean, we all thought that, what we were doing was going to be okay because the Republican Attorneys General Conference or Association was behind it, and they financed it and everything. And eventually it's going to come out. And then, and then it becomes a situation where whose authority supersedes whose in this country, and then you're getting back to a really civil strife, because if you've got a highest law officer in the state of Tennessee and 17 other states saying they don't agree with the election, and they didn't agree, they are vouching for the goodwill of all of those people that were up in DC, that they were good meaning sovereign citizens exerting their patriotism in their defense of whatever they thought they were defending, while they were bashing that guy over the head and crushing that other one in the door. You know, I guess what I would say is that I'm speculating that there were more people involved, and that is about to come out.
Yeah.
Whether, I'm sure there's all kinds of crazy narratives floating around. Like that was like there are some people that would say that the FBI was in on it because they were trying to make it look like the Trumpers were doing something bad. Or, who knows? They have already said that those people weren't really Trumpers at all. They were Antifa dressed up as the MAGA crowd. I mean, that's one of the fairy tales that's floating around down here, and some people believe that. But right? What I think eventually, if we get down to any kind of truth in this investigation, is that the Republican Attorney General's Association, that organization will get dragged out into the light over this, and then the American justice system will be faced with the very difficult question of how do you hold an attorney general, let alone 18 of them, accountable for mobilizing and financing what turned into an attempted coup.
Right.
And then that opens up more questions and problems and possibilities for further escalation of the civil strife that we're already facing. So I really don't know where it leads.
Sure.
I don't want to speculate too much because I think it has yet to be revealed how that whole thing is gonna come out in the wash. But
no doubt. Yeah, that was a weird one, man. But something about it always felt, I know you don't want to speculate, so we don't have to belabor it, but something always, to me as a Canadian observing, it felt like the mainstream narrative about that just wasn't all there. Like, there's no way that these wackos, I mean, what did those people think? That woman ran in there like she was going to do something and got shot. Like, these people were unhinged, largely. So where's the motivation coming from?
Well, I think that there's a very large swath of America that is loyal to democracy so long as their interests are covered. And the second that they think that there's more, the second that they think that they might actually lose an election, their loyalty to democracy itself goes out the window. Right. And what we saw on January 6th was a grab for like, no, we liked democracy, but now that Joe Biden got elected as the president, or we don't believe it, we're not going to go with that kind of democracy. It's going to be something else. And then that begs the question: what were they going to replace it with?
Well, yeah,
four more years of Trump or something. Like, were they going to make it up as they went along? Like the country's 250 years old, and there's like a due process and a protocol for these things. And I can hardly speculate on what was going on in the minds, but I can say that there's probably not all that much.
I think that's fair. And I think that's all you really need to say about that. Honestly, Mike, I'd be remiss if I didn't take us back, just to wrap it up, back to Memphis 20 years ago. I'm just a monstrous fan of the band. Levon Helm, I mean, he's it for me. Can you just say a few words about what he was like to work with as a musician, as a person? I'm just so infatuated by him. I actually, before he passed away, my father and I were looking at going down to Nashville to see him play at the Ryman, and that obviously didn't materialize. But any info you can give me about this guy who is something of a hero to me, even though I'm too old to have heroes, just what was it like working with Levon and your impressions of him? And please.
Levon was salt of the earth cat. And, when give you an insight into what kind of man he was.
Please.
When shit hit the fan for us, sorry if you got to bleep that one.
No.
When it hit the fan for us and we got the call from California that the project needed to be stopped, and this inconclusive end to our recording session, I I didn't have a lot of money, personal money of my own. What I did have, I actually, at the time put in Lee's hands so he could get home. I was, I was in the worst frame of mind, disappointment, and just, I was mortified that this was happening. And he had come all the way down from Woodstock and needed to, go home with something. And anyway, but I told him at the time, I was like, this isn't over. I'm going to get this resolved. I'm not going to rest until this is resolved. And I remember him putting his hand on my shoulder and said, man, I've been through a lot of shit in my life. And I've seen a lot of music business situations unfold. And I know that this isn't your fault and that you have no control over this situation. And you need to know that I know you don't have any control over this situation. I don't hold it against you. He's like, and he invited me to come up to Woodstock. And he came through Nashville several more times on his way out to play in the King Biscuit Blues Festival and other shows that he had going on in Memphis and Arkansas and stuff. And he would stop in and visit, and we'd grab a meal together and catch up and stuff like that, until he started getting too sick.
Right.
But, he's the impression that he left me with, the deepest one, was that he had faced adversity and pushback in his musical life. He had faced setbacks. He had been ripped off. He had been cheated. He had been, not just once, many times. That was a lot of the stories. Was how mistreated somebody that I held in such high regard actually had been. And his determination, he walked away from music. I don't know if you know about that, but when they started booing Bob Dylan back in the day, he walked away from it, and the music pulled him back. The music, not the business part of it, but the music. And my situation was intractable. I couldn't move forward. I was stuck in that 6-record deal. He knew it. We visited a few more times, and he was, he knew that I was going through a similar thing, a disillusion and disappointment. And wow, all of this that I've done leading up to this point that I recorded with you guys, it's all for nothing. I'm not going to get it. I'm stuck in this deal. This is just like too more than I can bear. Mm-hmm. And his words of encouragement at that time they sustained me. He said, they took the joy of the music away from me too. And he said, but I refused to let them do that. I love music, and they took the joy of it away from me for a while, but I found it again, and I never let it go. And so I took his words to heart. And when I was tired, I was bored of feeling sorry for myself and tired of feeling sorry for myself from what I had lost in Memphis, I picked myself up and carried on. And I think that in large measure to the kind of encouragement that Levon gave me that time. Wonderful. And I think that gives you an insight into the kind of man he was right up to the end.
Yeah. That's always how he struck me, just in whatever video clips or interviews were just authentic. He spoke, it was purely him. He didn't sugarcoat. He just spoke. He was just so authentic. It felt like to me. And
a gentleman, perfect gentleman. I mean, I never saw him act in any other way other than being like a perfect gentleman. And when David and Spooner were there, they started telling some stories, and Levon was celebrating Luther was complimenting Levon on his book, This Wheel's on Fire, which I recommend anybody to read. It's a great, great, great book. Definitely. Of memoirs. But he was complimenting him, and Levon turned to David and said, you guys need to write a book about those early Aretha Franklin sessions, and and that Percy Mayfield, and David Hood started talking about, he's like, oh, I was playing a Hofner on that session. I wanted to sound like Paul McCartney, and it's like When a Man Loves a Woman, the Percy Sledge, just getting an insight and being a fly on the wall while these guys were relating. There was no ego there. They were all like, had admiration and respect for each other. That was just like, it was, it meant to me that they actually were these giants that I thought they were when I was a youngster. They actually were that.
That's really nice to hear that they often say don't live long enough to meet your heroes or whatever, or you don't want to meet your heroes, but you kind of did, and they held up.
They did.
Yeah. Well, we could maybe use some more people like that in the world, huh? Or maybe there are more people like that in the world who are just, maybe like you, just pursuing your craft and.
You always got to accentuate the positive, man. I think our world's got away from that. You got to accentuate the positive.
Tremendous. Yeah.
Look for the good in people. I think that it's a guiding light.
Beautiful. Well, I do think we can leave it there. Mike, what's the best way, like if people want to check your tour dates or they got to listen to the album, first of all. If you listen to this episode, you have to listen to the album. What's the best way to do that?
Well, I'm out on all of the streaming platforms, and you can purchase the album in CD form or in digital form on my website. And the vinyl is going to be ready in January. Oh. I think that our projected date arrival of the vinyl is like January 20 something.
Okay.
So you can put in pre-orders for vinyl if you're, they sent me my test pressings of the vinyl and I put that record on, and it's like 800 times better than listening to it on CD. So I strongly encourage any listeners that are considering buying the record to pre-order the vinyl or to circle back with me in January and check it out. Beautiful. But CDs are available, digital files are available. And all the streaming platforms, it's all there.
Right on.
And we t-shirts and rolling papers and stickers and all kinds of swag, bandanas.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'll have to swing by the store, the digital store, and see what I can. Vinyl. Hey, with that album art that we've all seen, where it's just like the stylized name of or did you have something else in mind for the album art?
No, it's just going to be that image, but at scale.
Cool. Very cool.
It was originally drawn at scale. It was originally drawn to be the LP size.
Neat. Right. Okay. Well, Mike, like I said, I can't thank you enough for your time. And this was far better than expected. I was really looking forward to it, but this was a great moment, I think, for this podcast.
I enjoyed it too, Patrick. Thank you so much, man.
Take care, Mike.
Right.
Just let my mind go drifting out where the river's flowing all the way down and out to the sea, where the fog is lifting and a cool breeze blowing. Come along with me.
Thank you for listening to the North Bank Media Podcast. If you enjoy this conversation, please subscribe on YouTube and give us a like. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please subscribe as well and leave a 5-star review.